This is the third annual mental health panel discussion. The first one was in May during Mental Health Awareness Month. And then last year, of course, we had to become virtual. And this year as well, we are doing it in July, Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So TACA, the Tidewater African Cultural Alliance, has the mission of uniting the greater Tidewater region through community service, community outreach, educational programs, as well as cultural arts and events. And I want to go ahead and introduce our moderator, Natasha Ewa. And before I do that, I want to read a little about her. Here is her bio. Natasha was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and partially raised in the UK before immigrating to Rhode Island. She has her BS in psychology from Lincoln University, and she came to Virginia in 2012, where she pursued and received the Master's in Social Work from Norfolk State University. She is a licensed clinical social worker, a poet, a licensed Zumba instructor, and a lover of shoes. Natasha is also a breast cancer survivor who finds joy in creative measures that unify people who have more in common than they may like to think. She is excited to provide expertise in mindfulness approaches, psychological responses, data collection and feedback assessment, and to assist in the enhancement of this organization, which is greatly needed in our Hampton Roads area of Virginia. So Natasha has been moderating this event for the past 3 years, including this one. And I and the rest of the board are so grateful to her for taking this on. She is one of the founding members or one of the founders along with me of TACA. So I am so excited and happy and grateful that she takes this on in addition to her large workload and very busy life. So the next person I will introduce you to is Zoe, and she will also be helping us and specifically helping Natasha to make this panel discussion work. So Zoe is actually our board secretary. She was born in Washington, DC. Zoditu Zoe Tadesse is of Ethiopian descent and currently resides in Norfolk. She became a member of the TACA organization in 2019 and is excited to serve as the board secretary. She obtained her bachelor's degree in psychology from Howard University and a master's from the George Washington University in Education and Human Development in 2013. Throughout her professional career, Zoe has worked in the social services field and possesses a strong passion for supporting youth and families through a holistic and strength-based approach and community advocacy. So it looks like Natasha is ready to start and is sharing her screen. So I will turn everything over to her. You are in great hands, and thank you once again for joining us in this interactive panel discussion on the mental health stigma within the African community.
Awesome, thank you so much, Rita. Before I keep it going, can I just get a thumbs up if you guys can hear and if you guys can also see the screen well? Okay, awesome, thank you. Rita always does a great job of introducing the organization, so thank you for that, Rita. As she also mentioned, July is also Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. When we did this the first year, as she mentioned, we did this in May, but we recognize the importance of making sure that we align this with the minority community, as mental health is something that is extremely still taboo within many minority cultures. And so henceforth, we moved this from May to July. Before I bring in Zoe, who is going to go over the bio of our panelists, I just want to really quickly go over the reasons that we are even here today. So for one, mental health on the continent of Africa is still a learning curve. So we've come a long way. However, there's still so much more there is to learn, and there's still a lot of room for acceptance and growth. Secondly, mental illness in African culture, again, continues to be taboo. The African country with, at least right now, as of 2020/2021, the African country of Djibouti at 5.1%, followed by the African islands of Cape Verde and the African country of Tunisia, where they tie at both 4.9% of its population suffer from depression. So at this time, based on statistics, they have the highest rates of depression. When we move to other parts of Africa, such as the country of Kenya and Ivory Coast, right now they are having a significant crisis with suicide. The Caribbean countries of Suriname as well as Guyana right now also have the highest rates of suicide. Excuse my misspelling right there. The Caribbean as a whole, unfortunately, right now only spends approximately 4.3% of its healthcare funds on mental health. As we know, that is far from enough. African Caribbeans in general who live in predominantly white neighborhoods, and this is statistics specific to the UK, have been found to have higher rates of the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And that is more so amongst those who are African or Caribbean, but are British born. And in short, the global pandemic has impacted humans as a whole. That's why we are here today. Rita has gone over her bio as the founder. Thank you for creating such an amazing organization that's well needed in the Hampton Roads area and slowly going worldwide, proud to say. A fun fact about Rita, she is the first African-born female presenter at the International Zumba Instructor Convention. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with Zumba or the Instructor Convention, just go ahead and Google that and you'll find a lot of information. All right, so on to our panelists. Zoe, who is representing both the US and the country of Ethiopia, is going to go ahead and read the bios for us.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. So now I will share some information regarding our wonderful panelists. My apologies. Okay, I do apologize for that. All right, so first up we have Dr. Shelley Aboagie. Dr. Shelley Aboagie was born in Ghana, West Africa, and moved to the US at the age of 13, where she lived in the Bronx, New York, with her parents and two brothers. Initially, she found adjusting to American culture challenging, but with her friendly personality, she was able to develop a social network with her peers that allowed her to acclimate to the US more quickly. Dr. Aboagie attended Lincoln University and earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. Upon completing her bachelor's, Dr. Aboagie went on to attend Bowie State University and earned a degree in mental health counseling and earned her doctoral degree in counselor education and supervision. Dr. Aboagie works in a variety of capacities at Marymount University, supporting students as a wellness facilitator and adjunct professor in the psychology department. Currently, Dr. Aboagie is an adjunct faculty at Marymount University and educational counselor with the College Board in Washington, D.C., which reflects on her lifelong passion for human development and higher education. In her spare time, she enjoys traveling and spending time outdoors in nature. Fun fact, she wanted to be a flight attendant after high school. She interviewed with Delta Airline and was hired. However, she was threatened by her parents to either go to college or return back to Ghana. Welcome, Dr. Aboagie.
Oh, just a quick note. I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's actually Aboagie is her last name. So.
I do apologize.
Oh, it's okay.
That ringing phone threw me off.
Thank you.
All right. On to our next apologist, and please feel free. I've got the pronunciations here, but if I am mispronouncing anything, please feel free to interrupt and correct me so I say it correctly as I move.
Before you start.
Yes.
My last name is it's a very common mistake, so no offense taken. There's no W at the end, but it happens all the time. I've lost a lot of money that way, but
All right, so next up we have Chinomso Nwachukwu. Chinomso is the founder of Talk Niger, an organization founded by Nigerians for Nigerians to help reduce the stigma faced by those with mental health conditions in the Nigerian community, both on the continent and abroad within the diaspora. Chinomso resides in the state of Maryland and has a Bachelor of Arts degree in print journalism from Lincoln University and a master's degree in social service administration from the University of Chicago. He works on projects focused on mental health as well as substance abuse treatment and prevention. Chinomso is also an uncle, brother, friend, and storyteller. He is the son of a historian who often referenced the African proverb, "Until the lion has his or her own storyteller, the hunter will always have the best part of the story." Chinomso in his free time enjoys fostering communities of like-minded individuals and engaging in communities to promote healthy living, exercising, and laughing, lots of it. Fun fact, the bike he ordered from China for $20 during the pandemic in 2020 is still not here.
Are you still waiting on that bike, Chinomso?
I'm still
Fusion bike.
I'm still hopeful. One day.
He's still hopeful. Hope is good.
All right, moving along, we have Agata Minor. Agata S. Minor is a Cape Verdean native, a mental health specialist in the role of care coordinator / case manager within the Middlesex County Case Management Organization, Central New Jersey. Agata works with youth from ages 5 through 21 who are diagnosed with various mental health and intellectual disabilities, with the focus of linking them to community-based supports. Agata has resided in the United States since the age of 3 with her Cape Verdean immigrant parents. She is a wife and a mother to 3 smart, adventurous, and energetic children, ages 10, 7, and 5. Fun fact, she has a passion for event planning and traveling.
A quick correction on my name, it's Agata.
Agata.
Yes.
Okay.
And I appreciate all of you guys making sure that you step in with the correction. And I just want to say the next time we do this, I'm probably going to go ahead and get with Zoe ahead of time so that we are making sure that we have those correct.
Yeah, yes, that's why I wanted to be on a little early. All right, next up, and I think I can get this one right. We have DJ Rasta. That was a Virginia-based DC who was born and raised in the Caribbean island of Grenada. After completing secondary school, he immigrated to the United States and not too long after joined the U.S. Air Force, where he had the opportunity to tour the world and connect with a vast number of individuals. He is now retired after 21 years of honorable service. Thank you for your service, Choi. And a fun fact.
Thank you.
I am an active radio personality and a DJ. Welcome, DJ Rasta.
Thank you.
All right, and next up we have Grace Moore. Grace is representing the African country of Liberia and is a mental health therapist, licensed individual clinical social worker. Furthermore, Grace is a wellness advocate who is helping individuals lead intentional lives. Grace's work focuses on exploring feelings, thoughts, and behavioral patterns to develop a deep sense of self while gaining life-transforming insight. Grace believes in meeting her clients wherever they are on their path to self-actualization while supporting them to transcend to the next phases of their journey. Fun fact about Grace, she is passionate about creating a safe, non-judgmental, and transparent space for people to begin the path to healing and living intentionally. Welcome, Grace. All right, next up we have Zoe Walton. Zoe Walton, who represents the United States of America, is currently a kindergarten teacher who will soon be transitioning to work for DCPS. Zoe actively writes blogs on her platform, Dear You Times Me, where she is an advocate for mental health and a relationship with Jesus.
Zoe.
Zoe.
Sorry, Zoe.
Of course, my mother would correct you. I would.
I do apologize. I am a published author that created a journal. All right, and last but not least, we have our facilitator today, Natasha Ewa. Natasha is a practicing psychotherapist in Virginia and the owner and CEO of the outpatient counseling practice, InThrive Therapy and Wellness, founded a few months after her bout with stage 2 breast cancer and cancer treatment, hence the name InThrive. Natasha received her undergraduate degree in psychobiology at Lincoln University and obtained her Master of Social Work at Norfolk State University before going on to be state board certified to practice independently. Natasha, who was born in Nigeria, migrated with her family to East London, UK, around the age of 1, and then migrated with her family to the United States at the age of 13, where she has resided ever since. Natasha's passion and drive to enter the mental health field stems from her obsession of how the mind works, coupled with her realization that minorities not only misunderstand mental illness, but those minorities who do experience mental health concerns within the diaspora are often misdiagnosed, judged, and even at times over-medicated as a result of little to no cultural competency about the intersection between mental health, mental wellness, language, and culture. Natasha has worked in mental health for almost 12 years in various capacities with individuals as young as age 5 and her oldest client in their 80s. In her spare time, Natasha teaches Zumba, writes poetry and blogs for breast cancer platforms, does photography, shops a bit too much, and loves on her almost 4-month miracle baby boy. Busy lady. Fun fact about Natasha, she was featured on the TV show For My Man as an expert psychotherapist.
Thank you so much. So appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, so that we can keep it moving, we are going to go over the rules of today. First and foremost, please remember that this is a safe space. Self-disclosure is not always easy, so being mindful that when someone is sharing that we're being considerate. Also be mindful of time so that others have a chance to speak. 2 hours, typically, this is a conversation that could probably go on for days, but we don't have days. So when you are sharing, just be mindful that you are not taking up too much time so others can also speak. There is absolutely no obligation to answer a question or to respond to a statement. Please keep your microphone muted unless you are actually speaking to avoid background noise. Please, no shame-based languages. And if you are triggered, know that it's completely okay to log out, take space, drop a personal message to either myself, but you're also not obligated to do that either. All right, so let's start with the definition of the African diaspora. What is that? It's something that we hear time and time again. I've also realized that it's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So the basic definition of this is people of Native African origin who are living outside of the continent, irrespective of their citizenship. The mass dispersion of peoples from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, the most popular trade from the 1500s throughout the 1800s. The African diaspora populations include African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, Canadian-born descendants, as well as many who live throughout the continent of Europe, such as Belgium, Sweden, Austria, Spain, so on and so forth. In short, you can find us pretty much everywhere. So we're going to go ahead and start with the very first question, and I'm actually going to pose this to the audience. Now, if you do want to speak, I would ask that you, if you're able to, through Zoom, you can drop, I think, a thumbs up, and I'll be able to indicate that you would like to speak. I'll call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and share. So with this first question, what does mental wellness Again, mental wellness mean to you? Whoever would like to share their answer to that first, or thoughts. What does mental wellness mean to you? I'll call on someone. 5, 4, 3. Okay. All right. Our board member Zoe is going to share with us how she defines mental wellness.
All right. Thank you, Natasha. To me, mental wellness essentially means feeling happy, feeling healthy, feeling comfortable, as if I am equipped to handle whatever the day brings my way. It really is just a sense of well-being for me. I would say just feeling like, again, I can handle whatever is thrown at me or whatever comes my way, feeling like I have the tools and the coping mechanisms to deal with different situations, not become overwhelmed or overly frustrated. And probably most importantly, to remain calm, making sure I have self-soothing and calming strategies in the event that something is triggering or upsetting, so that I can maintain my homeostasis or my balance. So being balanced in a sense.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Someone dropped in the chat that their definition of mental wellness is staying within the boundaries that I give myself. So thank you for sharing that. That's actually a good one. Mental wellness is not something that can be successful without boundaries, but mental wellness is also on a spectrum. So it looks different from person to person. And it also doesn't look the same from day to day. Is there anyone from the panel who would like to chime in on that?
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. For me, mental wellness is a lot of similarities to what people have already shared. It's just how I measure how functional I am in dealing with my day-to-day, what is routines, challenges, or just day-to-day stresses. And like you said, Natasha, it's on the spectrum for me. Sometimes I'm at my optimal best, sometimes I'm at a low, sometimes I'm average, right? I can handle things just on an average basis. And for me, a lot of things do impact this ability to function. It could be anything contributing from what I'm eating throughout the week, how much I'm sleeping, how much I'm dealing with my organization. That's, for me personally, that's a huge part of my mental wellness, is how organized and how clean my house is, my car is. That have a huge impact to my wellness and my ability to function. And it really just that and everything in between that contribute to my mental wellness. So it's just really a measurement for me, how I measure my ability to function.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Really quickly for the panelists, when you do speak, if you could just do me a favor and mention your name and that you were on the panel so that the audience is aware that it's someone from the panel speaking. I appreciate that, Grace. I'm glad that you brought up the word measurement because, again, we all measure wellness differently, but there are very specific types of measurements that let us know the difference between if someone is well or if someone is struggling with an actual illness. So really quickly, I'm going to go over the difference between mental health, mental illness, and then briefly over mental wellness. Mental health is something that each and every one of us deals with. As long as you're a human being, you have mental health. Just like all human beings have physical health, the state of your body, your mental health is the state of your mind, feelings, as well as your emotions. Basically, you live mental health every day. Now, mental illness, there's a disruption to your mental health. There's a disruption to your mental wellness. When we have a disruption to our mental wellness or our mental health, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a mental illness. But when it is severe and those measurements are on the far end of the spectrum, then we are talking about mental illnesses. Some of those we may be familiar with, such as mood disorders, that's anxiety, depression. We also have eating disorders such as pica, such as bulimia and anorexia. Then we have things such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which a lot of people are familiar with. And then schizophrenia and schizoaffective are some other mental illnesses. Again, just to piggyback off of what Grace on a panel had stated earlier, it is our ability to learn. It's our ability to feel, to express, to manage a range of both positive and negative emotions that's key to mental wellness. It's your ability to manage both and to manage both effectively. It is your ability to form and maintain good relationships with others. A quick quote from Dr. P. Maramba of Zimbabwe said that mental illness is viewed as a punishment by the gods. I'm going to say that one more time. Mental illness is viewed as a punishment by the gods. So who on the panel can give me a quick response to this? What do you feel? What do you hear when I read this quote? A punishment by the gods. Any board member? I'm sorry, I keep saying board member. Any panelist?
I guess my initial thought when I hear that makes sense. Where our stigma, right? Thinking about mental health has a punishment, it makes sense that it's stigmatized, right? Because when you are mentally ill, it's because you did something wrong and you're dealing with a punishment. So initially when you said that, I was like, oh, maybe this is where all of this, well, I'm sure it's not where the stigma came from, but it definitely lends the lens why people feel the way that they feel. And it comes from African, says from Zimbabwe. So it makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Makes sense. Anyone else on the panel who can share their thoughts to this quote? I'm going to start.
This is
Troy.
Troy.
All right. Hey, Troy. Okay.
How are you? How's everybody?
Good.
All right. I think that one's very interesting statement. I think in most, well, a lot of countries, like for example, the Caribbean, we have like a older way of thinking. So viewing it as a punishment, I think it's an older way of thinking, maybe a little closed-minded. People deal with things differently, and it's a lot of circumstances that leads to people behaving, acting, and also having mental, health issues.
Mm-hmm.
And people just deal with things differently. So I think it's really a closed-minded way of thinking it's a punishment, and it's really not. Because if you view it as a punishment, then you also treat people a kind of way, rather than maybe seeing it as, it's something deeper and there's a root to the problem, and helping that person.
Thank you for that response. I just want to highlight your last statement where you said that if you treat it as a punishment, you're also going to respond to that person and treat that person according to what comes with a punishment. I want to challenge, I know that, yes, this is an old way of thinking, but I want to challenge that it's still a very common way of thinking. And the reason I say that is because one of the things that I see within my practice is, yes, the younger generations are able to see beyond the older ways of thinking, but the younger generation still resides with their grandparents. The younger generation still resides with their parents who were raised by their grandparents. And so the influence is still very much alive. And though we are breaking away from that, it is unfortunately still quite common. So talking about stigma and why and what fuels it, some of the things that fuel this stigma as it relates to mental health. Language barriers, that's a huge one, just not having the language to actually describe the symptoms. Culture, economics, social, and politics all combined. Importantly, a lack of mental health facilities. And of course, the reason that there's a lack of mental health facilities within our African diasporan countries is because we're still struggling with actually understanding it. So if we don't understand it, why would we build facilities to treat people who have mental illness? Hence, we also have a limited number of mental health professionals who can work within these facilities. And then discrimination based on perceived influence. So going back to this earlier quote, that lends to potentially believing that the reason this person might be, acting out, or the reason why this person might be having hallucinations is because it is something supernatural versus biological. Amina Lavelle from Haiti stated that there isn't a formal language of mental health within the country of Haiti. The executive director and founder of Global Trauma Research states this, that something simple like depression, the symptoms that we use to diagnose someone within the United States, it just won't make sense for the people of Haiti. They don't exhibit the same types of symptoms, so whatever diagnosis is given will not hold. I just wanted to share that. The next question, and this is for specifically our panelists, and I would like for you guys to answer as honest as you can. What is a mental health diagnosis that scares you? And just to give you guys an example, when I first started in this field, the diagnosis that I was the least comfortable with would include schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or any diagnosis that came with auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations. And that's because though it wasn't foreign to me, I didn't understand it enough. And so therefore it made me a bit uncomfortable. So for the panelists, can you share what diagnosis has scared you before or even continues to scare you today? Okay, I got that. Okay, you can unmute yourself. Hold on one second, you're still mute. There we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm one of the panelists. When I first started working in the mental health field, I was most intimidated by schizophrenia and schizoaffective clients. But over time, as I became more educated on the diagnosis and, the symptoms and what affects the person, it came to be one of the diagnoses I best worked with, because I was able to find a different way to approach it and understand and show understanding to them as I got more comfortable with it. But I think that right now I'm pretty comfortable with most, at least what I'm mostly faced with on a day-to-day basis in the field that I do work now.
Can you share a little bit more about the types of diagnosis that you do face on a day-to-day at work?
Yes, so my children, it varies. Heavy autism, from lower functioning to higher functioning, a lot of depression, especially during the pandemic, a lot of suicidal ideations, anxiety. I'm trying to think. Very few eating disorders, a lot of parent-child conflicts, or other intellectual disabilities like learning disabilities overall. So it's a very broad, very wide scope of diagnoses.
Huge spectrum. Okay. Awesome. Can we have Dr. Shelley, can you share a little bit? I'm curious to know your response on, with someone who has a doctorate and you've also been in this field for a while, wanting to work for Delta Airlines first, but, being threatened to stay. What's a diagnosis that intimidated you or scared you prior?
Okay, so growing up in Ghana, I had one of my uncle, the first time I actually witnessed mental health was one of my uncles that I was very, very close with. I kind of saw him stripping in the middle of the street out of nowhere. And I had no idea what was going on. I had questions and I was trying to figure out what happened. And then later on in life, I realized that he had late onset. He was about 29 at that time. And so, I've obviously, the Ghanaian community, especially with my culture, they were kind of covering things up a little bit, did not really want to explain into detail as far as what was going on, because I was a child at that time. And so, later to come to find out he had developed schizophrenia. And so when I started learning more about mental illness, that was one of the illness that kind of resonated with me because of my vision of what I saw my uncle go through. right? And it was obviously it was very hard. It was, you know, to witness that as a child. And so so treating individuals, like when I was a case manager, even when I do therapy, treating individuals, so because schizophrenia is more like, sometimes I have to be very careful because it's kind of like counter transparent sometimes, and I have to be mindful and self-aware because I tend to overdo things, you know, because I kind of want to save them, you know, almost, and you know, I feel like I do more for them compared to any other client that I work with. So I pulled away from working with individuals with schizophrenia because I knew that it was affecting me emotionally. So yeah, so I hope that answered the question. I know I kind of talked about different things, but
no, it absolutely did. I'm going to call on one more panelist, and then I'm going to also open this to the audience for anyone who'd like to share. Zoe Walton, how about you? Can you give some insight on this as far as your personal experience?
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the ones that scared me the most, I feel like it was talked about a lot in this cult setting that I was brought up in for a little bit of my college experience, was schizophrenia. But then also in college, I remember watching the movie Split. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that. The movie by M. Night Shyamalan.
Mm-hmm.
How do you pronounce his name? And I cannot remember what this actor's name is, but dissociative identity disorder. After seeing that movie, I was like, oh my gosh, like that is not something that I would ever want to experience. And I don't know if it falls beneath like the schizophrenic, umbrella or not, but I think dealing with something as heavy as that, because he had the personality of a little girl, of a little boy, of an elderly woman, of himself, just regularly like how we are right now. He had an older gentleman, just so many different things. And that was, a little, I don't want to say disturbing, but it was just very interesting to see how each one of those personalities would come to the forefront and then go back, and he'd be a different person every time. So definitely dissociative identity disorder is the one that kind of gets me.
It's a very unique diagnosis, extremely unique. Thank you for sharing that.
Can I chime in?
Absolutely.
It's going to be really quick. This is Grace, one of the panelists. I have a private practice, co-founder for private practice. One of my co-founders is in the audience, Margaret. So I wanted to chime in my personal work as a therapist. My approach is always experience and symptom based, and not usually focusing on diagnosis, but I do diagnose because I have to, right? You have to diagnose to build insurance. But I would say the diagnosis and the aligning symptoms that really is a challenge for me, and we laugh about it all the time, me and my colleagues, is borderline personality disorder. And I'll say the thing about it that's really challenging is just the instability that it's presented with. You never know. A client can be great today, and an hour down the road, you get a call from the emergency room because they are now impatient for something they've done. So for me, it's just the temperament of how the disorder showcasing people's life that makes it really challenging for me. It's really spectrum based because it is this is just a lot of instability. So for me, that's the most challenging one.
Thank you for sharing that. Borderline personality disorder is challenging. It's challenging. So thank you for that. Anyone in the audience who would like to chime in on this? As just a regular day-to-day citizen, have you experienced a person closely or an acquaintance who suffers from a mental illness? Lisette, let's hear what you've got with this.
Hi, so I am a behavior therapist currently working with children with autism. And so it kind of comes as a shock to me that autism could be classified as a mental illness. I always thought of it as a developmental disorder. So that, that was quite shocking to me, that I probably need to to approach the diagnosis a little bit differently, not in terms of how it's treated or therapy, but just the umbrella that it falls under. And
if I may interrupt you really quickly, Lisette,
Yes.
You are correct. And I think that it might have just been the way that it was stated, but she was sharing the spectrum of kids that she works with.
Yes.
So including, and she did mention developmental delay as well as mental and emotional illnesses as well. But as we know, with kids who are on the spectrum, they do tend to come with the emotional deficits as well. So you might have someone who is, high functioning, but they're suffering from some sort of social anxiety based on their developmental deficits.
Right. Right. So I guess sometimes it's always easy to compartmentalize things so that you can wrap your mind around it a little bit better. And I think that's me as a parent, because I'm a parent of a child with autism, and I'm also a parent of a child with clinical depression. And I think I had them in two separate pods almost, and never realized that there could be a connection between the two, not in terms of diagnoses, but just in terms of treatment.
Right.
That looking at some of the deficits of the child with autism, I never thought of therapy going beyond the applied behavior analysis, but now with this sort of new revelation, I would definitely consider therapy for that emotional, social emotional support and development as well.
Awesome. And I'm glad that, talking about this, helped you to recognize that. Thank you. So we are going to move on to another quote. Negative stereotypes and unfounded beliefs within the general public often lead to ostracism and, in some cases, abuse of the mentally ill. And this was spoken by Jennifer Forrester, the executive director of the National Mental Wellness Center on the island of St. Lucia. Can I have either a panelist or a audience member share their response to this quote? I'll read it one more time. Please make sure that you drop the hand emoji so that I know you would like to speak. Negative stereotypes and unfounded beliefs within the general public often lead to ostracism and, in some cases, abuse of the mentally ill. All right, Ms. Lisette, let's hear it.
I didn't realize my hand was still up, but I could.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe I need to take my hand down. I didn't realize. Lower hand. Okay, but I was just thinking that with mental illness, it would put you at risk, because sometimes it is more challenging to be able to be self-aware. And so these individuals can find themselves in potentially harmful situations, and just kind of leaves them susceptible and open to abuse that way.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Really quickly, someone from the audience dropped in the chat, and this is very important. She stated that this quote also speaks to the criminalization of the mentally ill. That's huge. Ezra from the audience.
Hi, so I'm from the UK. I'm a PhD researcher in dementia. And
welcome.
Hi. So that quote is quite interesting to me because I was quite surprised when I first saw some research based in Kenya of, for example, of elder abuse. It was the first time I sort of heard about elder abuse of those with mental illness and stuff. So yeah, so obviously here in the UK, that's not something that typically happens with mental illness or with a diagnosis of dementia, although stigma does really happen here. But it was the first time I sort of came across it as a research within the African community of those ostracized and actually some of those having been abused or deprived of food, water, or just locked away and ostracized within the community for having mental illness. So that was really stark for me.
It's devastating. And thank you for sharing that. Agatha, I see that you have your hand raised as well.
Yes, this makes me think of a couple things from when I was growing up in a household of migrant parents, and mental health is not really discussed at all. So you shy away, or not shy away, you don't really understand mental illness or the symptoms or behaviors that come with a lot of them. So when you do come across, or you grow up in a country where it is prevalent, you find yourself trying to stay away from people who act different, or you don't understand their behaviors. But then it also brings me to the the progression in the discussion of mental health and the awareness and understanding, and people becoming more open to understanding mental illness and how people can interact and assist these persons. It kind of, I guess, I don't know how I was tying those two together, but somehow like it brought me to my childhood, and also how people nowadays will say, oh, they're just being crazy, or they're using all those words that could be offensive to the people who have the illness, and you don't understand. So then I do agree that it causes people to act differently, until they've either experienced it through someone that they love or know, and then they educate themselves, and then they change the way that they behave towards the behaviors or illness.
Absolutely. Education is so important. Before we go on to the next slide, one of the things that I find that's quite prevalent even in today's time, especially with my clients, is actually simply the word illness. All right, so that word is scary and it's intimidating, because when someone hears the word illness, if we think of physical health and we think of physical illness, that typically means it's a worst case scenario, or something is seriously wrong. You need to bring in a medical professional so that you can feel better. In the mental health world, the word illness is scary. Most people who know that they suffer from depression don't want to be told that they have a mental illness. And so psychoeducation is also very important, so that people learn that there is a distinction between sadness, depression, clinical depression, ongoing depression, and things like that. So having that education can also help people be a little bit less intimidated. Sadness is something we all struggle with. Clinical depression is not something we all struggle with. So my next question, as a child, teen, or young adult, what were the stereotypes that you or your African-American, Latino, Caribbean parents had about mental health? Let's call in Chinomso. What were some of those stereotypes for you?
So this is Chinomso again. Growing up in Nigeria, it was so I'm from the Igbo tribe, so there's a term like Ndiara, which means like, crazy people. And my first encounter with someone with a mental health condition was our next door neighbor. And I watched how her family had her chained to a tree, and they brought her out during the day, and during the night they'll put her in this closet, and they essentially fed her as if she was an animal. So, but it would be like, oh, that's so-and-so, the mother of that crazy girl, right? So the label that stuck with that family is the family that produces crazy people, and that affected all aspects of their lives. So even if you were seeking to marry into that family, you would be cautioned, like, hey, there's a possibility that your future kids will be crazy.
Thank you for saying that. That's pretty deep, how one person's mental illness becomes the mental illness of the family. And so it's not just a stigma on them, it's you don't want to marry into that family because of their daughter who has, this diagnosis, or they're not even using that phrase, they're saying she's crazy. So that's another barrier. If one person is suffering, in many cultures, that means the entire family is suffering. Choi, how about you? Can you share some of the stereotypes that you were familiar with as a child or teen?
As far as parents go, it wasn't really something that was talked about. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you would just think they're crazy and ostracize them. It's one of those things, And I want to say, for me personally, moving to the US is really where I got educated about mental illness. And so that's where I learned, but it was one of those things where you really didn't talk about them. And if you felt like someone had a mental illness, you would look at them as they're crazy and you stay away from them.
Mm-hmm. I'm writing down your statement. Moving to the US is where I learned about mental illness, because we're going to actually there's a quote on here or a question that lends to that statement, and we'll come back to that. Shelley, I think your hand is raised. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, yes, it is. Well, I kind of wanted to, because I know I had brought up, I talked about my uncle, and even up to now, to a point where we don't even, it's like he doesn't even exist, like, but nobody talks about him. I wanted to find out about what was going on, trying to check to see if there's any update about his progression, whatever. And they're like, well, we don't know where he is. So it's like and it goes back to, if we talk about it, if we acknowledge it, there's a chance that somebody else might think that it just runs in the family, and and it's something that they don't want to talk about, so it's like he's cast out from the family, which is mind blowing, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. All right, with this next quote, what became a one-way conversation was me being asked if I roamed the streets speaking incoherently, wearing sacks, or looking unkept. And this was a quote from a video that Zoe had shared with me. And the speaker, her name is Shanice Chigumba of South Africa. And she was just talking about how when she was struggling with depression and she took the initiative to seek out mental health support from a mental health professional, this is one of the questions that was asked of her. She was asked, do you roam the streets incoherently? Do you roam the streets wearing sacks? And do you roam the streets looking unkept? And she had shared how that just turned her off, because now she is being made to feel as though the only way she can be classified as someone who needs mental health support is if she's incoherent, she looks unkept, and she's walking around in rags. Anyone who would like to speak to this? Chinomso?
Yeah, it made me think of, growing up back home. It's funny now that a lot of Afrobeat artists have dreads, because back then in Nigeria, if you have dreads, they will label you as someone who was struggling with a mental health challenge. And also, at least in Nigeria, from my experience, we don't look at mental illness from like a spectrum, right? People either think you have the most severe condition, or the mood disorders are not so much paid attention to. Like, there's no space to be depressed or anxious, right? It's either you're happy or you're mad, right? Mad being like some type of psychotic breakdown. So it makes sense. So because that's what we're accustomed to seeing, in terms of like, there's this person who's having these challenges and their families have given up on them. So now they're living in the street. It was actually it touched me. I went back to Nigeria for the first time in 2015. And one of my classmates, one of the smartest kids in my class, and I saw him now, he was now living in a gutter, just, picking trash. Like, he must have had some type of psychotic breakdown. And rather than the family seeking help for him, he was, pushed out. So now so when Nigerians, from my experience, think of like a mental illness, they think of the most extreme version, not on that continuum.
Yeah, that's huge. Thank you for that. It's they really struggle with understanding that it's on a spectrum. Lisette, I see that your hand is raised as well.
Hi, yes. So first of all, growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, my experience was a little bit different, because my mother was actually a psychiatric social worker. And Choi, she actually got some of her training in Grenada. So I remember her traveling there in the 70s to be trained. And so our view as a family was quite different. She made us understand I remember from a very early age, some of the differences and what people perceive mental illness to be, and what it actually is. I remember her stopping the car on the way to school to treat patients, which I know is something that would not be done here in the US, but she understood what it was to serve her community. And so if someone didn't come into a clinic and that was someone who didn't really, was unkept at this point, someone, just almost destitute, but she will still pull up at the side of the road. She would go get out her medical bag and she would give either the medication or an injection or whatever the person needed. I remember going with her with baskets of food to houses on a weekend so she could provide for family members who couldn't support themselves. So I kind of grew up with a different perspective, and mental illness was not something very foreign. It was not something I was afraid of as a child. So walking down the street, if someone looked unkept or someone was talking to themselves, it was like, okay, I just understood. So it was never something foreign. And I'm quite fortunate to have had that experience.
And I'm so glad that you did. That's huge. I'm really appreciative of your mother for having the background that she did, because honestly, that also provided you, room for your own children and how you responded to them. So that's huge. Grace, I do see your hand raised, but just because of time, I want us to go on to the next one, but I would like for you to respond to the next one if that's okay. So this question, Grace, you can actually start us here. What are your thoughts and response? And this word has come up a few times today already, but what are your thoughts in response to the word crazy, which is thrown around like water? And let's be honest, some of the most professional individuals use this word quite loosely as well. Sometimes it's used and we're not realizing that we're using it. And like I think someone had mentioned earlier, there could be someone in the room who that would be offensive to, right? So Grace, can you share your response to this word?
This word, crazy, it's been a long time since I've heard someone use crazy to refer or describe mental illness. But I certainly do understand that it's the easiest way for a lot of people to explain what other people are experiencing, especially we were talking earlier about when mental illness manifests in such a physical way where people are unkempt or picking things up off the streets or behaving in a way that seemed bizarre to us. It's easy for people like they're crazy, or they're not like us. They don't fit society's standard of how we're supposed to act. And I think for a lot of people, it's just an easy way to explain what they're seeing. Clearly has a negative connotation, right? Because having mental illness does not mean that you're crazy. But I want to also say it's important that we celebrate that we've come a long way in terms of people now recognizing that, yeah, you could say it, but it's not as acceptable. People say it anyways, but it's not as acceptable as it was where everyone was saying it. Now people say it and it's like, that's not appropriate. So we have enough knowledge now for people to feel uncomfortable to say it, or say it and people around them feel uncomfortable. So I definitely think we've come some ways with being able to use this word so openly.
Thank you for that. I would like Zoe Walton to also share next, but Grace, as you were speaking, it reminds me of the word retarded, which is a word that I would hope we all know is not a word that we should be using. But we've come a long way with that. People would use it jokingly, people would use it professionally, and it really is quite degrading. Zoe, how about you on this? What's your response to the word crazy?
I agree with what Grace was saying. I think that it's been a very long time since, and maybe not that long, but a decent amount of time since we've heard others refer to those that are dealing with mental illnesses as crazy. I know I was sitting here thinking about this and I was like, oh my gosh, like I still use the word crazy, but I use it when like I use it jokingly with my friends. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's so crazy. Cause like she'll be playing with my dog and she'll be doing something to him. And I'm like, she is just crazy. But like I also negatively use it to refer to myself. And I didn't comment on it earlier, but I'm actually diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, Grace. So I would love to talk to you to help you out, girl, because I understand it's me. I'm the one doing that. But I think when I'm going through those like episodes, I am like, yo, I'm going crazy. Like I genuinely feel crazy. And I will refer to myself in that way, which I know isn't like, positive, and that's negative self-talk and all that wonderful stuff. But I think just now most people, I think, don't refer to the mental illness as crazy. I think they refer to those that are, unkept and living on the street and that do talk to themselves as crazy. I feel like we see that more, though those people are also dealing with mental illnesses or just dealing with, hard times that have come upon them. I think that those people are labeled crazy. And then I think jokingly within, I would say for my demographic, that not middle age, what am I talking about? That young adult, that young adult status, I think that we kind of refer to each other jokingly like that, but it's not in like a degrading way. And it's a very fine line, but it's not in a degrading way when we are saying it to each other. It's more like what your actions or what you're doing is crazy, and not in like the insane kind of way. But I was definitely reflecting on this myself because I was like, well, I say the word crazy, but I mean it jokingly. And I'm not like directly, and these are with people that I know do suffer with mental illnesses and things like that, but it's like I'm not ever directly saying like if they're having like an episode or anything like that or dealing with that portion of their time, I'm never like, oh, you're crazy right now. Like, no, it's always just joking about random stuff like my roommate playing with my dog.
I do want to pull, because I would love to hear what board member Zoe thinks. What are your thoughts? What can you share on your thoughts or response to the word crazy?
I agree that it kind of such as what both of the panelists thus far have said. I feel like it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be, at least in a professional sense. You're not encountering individuals as often calling people who have a mental health diagnosis, such as depression, as crazy. But I do believe when you get to the more symptomatic, I'll say, not extreme, but where the symptoms are a little bit more prevalent, such as the hallucinations, such as someone who may be responding to an auditory stimulus that we don't hear. When you see those individuals, the words crazy can be thrown around a little bit more. And then, as Zoe said, I think it's still something culturally that, like the word retarded, as Natasha referred to that earlier, it's still something that is used as a part of pop culture almost, or culture among young people. Not meant to be degrading, but I believe that the importance of it is we're never meaning to be degrading, but keeping in mind that for individuals who have heard that label in a negative way, for you to use it jokingly can be offensive and insulting. And I think as time goes on, it's one of those things, hopefully, that will continue to shift and continue to change.
Very well said.
If I can, I kind of want to challenge what you said. So I think that I agree with what you're saying. It is a part of pop culture and things like that. But I think that it's important to communicate, because we don't communicate. Like we say, we'll sit here and claim, oh, I can communicate real well and but we don't communicate well. Like if we're having an issue, like communication works really well until we have conflict, right? So I think that with being like, let's say with the whole throwing out the word crazy and things like that, it could be seen as offensive. But if I never speak up and tell you like, hey, the way that you're, using that word is offensive to me, then I feel like we have a hard time, you know, breaking that, perhaps the stereotype of that word or how we're using that word with other people. So I just kind of want to challenge, not, that wasn't like to come at you, but I think to challenge just like all of us in general, just to be, of course, like you said, mindful of that, but knowing like if we don't communicate that it's offensive, then it's just going to keep going and going and going and not going to be, you know, stopped and broken off.
That's a great point. Thank you for highlighting that, because without communication, change doesn't come, and without discomfort, change also doesn't come. But I do want to state in the audience, Dr. Walton was responding to Zoe. He stated that, yes, we more readily identify persons with externalizing behaviors rather than those we internalize. And that's huge. Thank you for stating that, Dr. Walton, because external behaviors are easy to see. Right. When I was going through my breast cancer diagnosis, one of the toughest things for me is people often thinking that I was well because of how I looked on the outside, not knowing all of the pain that I was actually in. The only time people really know that I was unwell is when I lost all of my hair. And that's because it's external. It's easy to see. With mental illness, it's difficult because it's an internal battle. Depression is an internal battle. Schizophrenia is an internal battle. And it's difficult for those in society. If I walk into a room, I'm not readily going to be able to say that this person is schizophrenic unless I happen to be walking into them, you know, engaging with their external stimuli. So it's just something to keep in mind, that this is another reason why we may use words loosely, because when we walk into a room, we don't typically think that there may be someone in there who will have external symptoms readily unable to see. So because of time, we're going to keep it moving. This next quote stems from the West African country of Liberia. Many people with psychiatric disorders have been struggling for years with spiritual healers or herbalists and have not been receiving medical treatment. I have even seen individuals who were chained or locked up at home because of social stigma or fear of aggressive behavior. But when people accept that these are medical conditions and that we treat these patients, they finally have relief from their symptoms and can live normally within their communities. So Grace, can you start us off as, you know, representing the country of Liberia as well? What are your thoughts to this quote?
Yeah, that's a great quote, right? Because I think the ending of the quote is talking about resolution, where we need to be going, understanding, and I think what's really important is this idea of, maybe in the United States, right? Mental health organizations get the least amount of fundings because it's not always so tangible. You can't look under a microscope and see what's happening with someone with depression. You may be able to do a brain scan and see something, but it's not like a cancer that you may not have a physical outlook, but you can look under a microscope and like, yep, there's something there. So even in the US, funding for mental illness is so scarce compared to other medical condition. And I think if we start identifying mental health as part of the medical system, then it will be a lot more, not even a lot more, it will be less of a stigma. People can really say, I have a headache, I need to go to see a doctor. I have a broken bone, I have to go see a doctor. But how often can people say, oh, I'm feeling really low today, let me go talk to a mental health provider to see what's going on with me, right? I think that's the language that we need to start pushing for, and really seeing, because we live in a society that's very tangible based. We are about data driven. Mental health is very qualitative because it's you telling me how you're feeling and me making sense of it with you. So I think if we start spending more time, because it's the idea of join them, beat them, help them see a different light. But realistically, if we can push and be more intentional about our work and say, this is a medical condition, this is medical as much as a headache, as much as high blood pressure, I think we'll have a lot less stigma. And maybe a lot more funding, right? Because if there's a lot more funding, then it's more access, and access can be a way to destigmatize as well.
Yeah.
So I definitely resonate with this quote that we should start seeing it as medical.
I appreciate that. You hit it nail on the head. If there's access, that creates room for increased education. All right, this is going to be for both the panel and the audience. How do we as a people continue to perpetuate false, unhealthy, or misinformation about mental health and these stereotypes? So what are we doing? Let's think about ourselves personally. Let's think about our families. Let's think about our colleagues. What are we as a people doing to perpetuate these unhealthy stereotypes about mental health? Let's start with Chinosa. What do you have for us? What do you think we do to perpetuate?
I think there's a belief out there, even amongst those in the behavioral health field. I have some, when we started my organization, we did a survey just asking people questions what their experience was around mental health. And there was a young lady, she said her mom was a nurse who dealt with clients who were battling mental health challenges. However, the conversation at home that she had with her children, like, it doesn't exist, right? So on one spectrum is like, I do this for a living, I know it's out there, but it doesn't affect us, right? So there's at least in the Nigerian community, that, because we're big on appearance, so it's kind of like, oh yeah, it's I know it exists, but it doesn't exist in our household, and it can't exist. So because of that, a lot of us are indeed suffering in silence, that we don't have that space where people can actually be genuinely authentic with themselves about the challenges that they're encountering. Because again, it is there, but it's not in my house.
That is so interesting and quite common. I see that a lot. I do. I see it where outwardly or outside of the home, we can pretend to accept it, but in here, we're not going to talk about it. In our house, it's not real, or in our house, this is how we deal with it, and we're going to make sure we don't talk about it. Sophie, I see your hand raised, and then we'll go to Dr. Shelley and then back to Zoe.
I was going to say, we don't talk about it. I didn't know that Zoe was having the mental illness issues that she was having until she came and she told us about it. And I'm hoping that I'm not overstepping bounds, but we were just unaware, clueless. I had no idea. So we just don't talk about it. And I think it's just something that we need to start bringing to the forefront. We need to talk about it.
Conversation. Absolutely. Shelley?
Okay, so one thing I noticed, because I actually teach in abnormal psychology now for undergrad, and even when I teach, there's a lot of students who will open up and share their struggles with anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, different kind of things that they're dealing with on a daily basis. Now, sometimes, this is via Zoom when I lecture, and students will put in the chat, oh, you've been in a crazy house. Oh, you've been in a mental asylum, or, and they'll say these things. And I find myself getting frustrated. And to them, I had one student get very defensive, and he said, it's like the N-word, like we just saying it to take the power out, to make it feel like it's okay. And I was like, I don't think so, because these words are very hurtful. And so education started with information. And so that's when I start to, kind of educate them on these things, that is the word, words are very powerful, and some folks will internalize it, and it's going to affect them emotionally. And so that's something that I had to kind of do to make sure that I'm educating the student. But it was eye-opening to kind of hear some of the things that they were saying, and to have an explanation behind that. That's why they're throwing these words out. And to me, I was like, that's not making sense. We need to find a better way to minimize the stigma and stereotypes.
Thank you for that. Zoe, before I go on to you, I want to share that one of the other ways that we often perpetuate, unhealthy ideas of mental health is the lack of cultural competency. And the reason I bring that up is because if you have an individual who, speaks Spanish, and they have made that intention to seek out a mental health professional. So they've decided, I'm not even going to talk to my family about this. They don't understand, but I'm going to take that step for me. And then they, come across or they meet a medical professional who has absolutely no cultural competency. What can happen is they can ruin that experience for that person. And then it taints their idea of mental health support, mental health resources. Now that person who is maybe their first language is Spanish or it's French, there's a bit of a language barrier. We who are in the field, we also have to do a better job of making sure that we're linking them to appropriate resources. If I do not have skills in treating PTSD, if Spanish is not my first language, and I know that my client does not speak English very well, it is my duty to make sure that I'm connecting them to the appropriate resources, because I could be doing more damage. And if they go home believing that experience is the experience of the masses, then even that person with a mental health disorder or illness isn't going to seek treatment. And it perpetuates that idea that there's something wrong with them and there's no help. And then in a roundabout way, it proves sometimes the point of their family members. We told you it was just you. We told you that those people can't help you. Right? I know in my family, there are a couple of individuals who say, all you do is talk to people all day and don't really understand the work that I do. And it's so much more than that. So much more than that. Zoe, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so I kind of want to play a game here, right? With our raise hand button. So it says, how do we as a people continue, right? So a lot of us are either African American. I know there are several others, but really quickly, can we do the little raise hand button if we grew up in the church, or if Christianity was one of our, prominent beliefs or religions or anything like that? Don't be shamed, y'all. Don't be shamed. Keep watching. He's watching. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But that's going through here. I see a lot of hands. A lot of hands raised, right? All right. So hands down, so she don't think that y'all want to say something after I finish, unless you really do. But so I think that is the first thing. That is kind of one of the issues. In that first quote really had rubbed me the wrong way. I was in my feelings because a punishment from the gods, okay, but what God are you talking about? Because, for me and myself, it's only one. Anyways, but going with that, the reason why I write my blogs the way I do is because I always try to connect it to you need Jesus and you need therapy. You cannot have one without the other. And I feel like we're always not we, but as an African-American community, as African community and things like that, I feel like it's very prominent that they push Jesus, they push God, they push all this stuff when you're like, oh, just pray and it'll go away, just fast and it'll go away. In the Bible, it talks about these things go out by fasting and by prayer, but no, these things go out by fasting, praying, and therapy. If I don't have that third piece, it is not going to go out. And I feel that it's really important to tap into that. And as a people, I think that we need to break away from that. It's fine. It's great that, God can do these things for us, but if we don't have, all the information going with it, therapists ought to come into the church. You know what I mean? We shouldn't let it be a taboo thing to talk about mental health in the church when mental health is seen in the church. There are people that are, literally dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, dealing with different disorders, dealing with different things that are going on mentally, and no one's speaking up about it. But then when they go to church, it's oh, well, we'll just pray about it and it'll be okay. They'll make it through and things like that. But no, we need more than that. We need Jesus and we need therapy, or, whoever your belief is, you need that and you need therapy coupled together. That's the only way that this thing works.
Thank you so much for that. Agatha, I would like you to share your thoughts on this too. But I just want to say kudos to you for saying that, Zoe, because I think you just gave me next year's topic. Mental health is seen in the church. So you and I, we're gonna talk a little bit further.
Yeah, it's funny because I was sitting here typing in the chat my response to this.
Were you?
But What I was saying in terms of perpetuating the false narratives, right, or the stereotypes, I was typing that I find myself a lot of the time advocating for my youth personally with their caregivers and their parents, because I work with a lot of Hispanic families or parents who do not speak English. So not only is language a barrier, so the communication is already really tough for them, so they don't even want to try. But when they have access to someone who is going to help them seek the education, number one, open up the line of communication, invite the other family members to the discussion table when we have, treatment team meetings, and helping them to understand that their child or person or whomever it is in their family is an individual, and that the stereotype may not apply to them. Like, you don't have to think that that stereotype applies to everybody. So what can you do differently for your child to help them, be what they say, get better, because they think that you treat it and it goes away. But like, how can you help them manage their diagnosis and live normal? Yeah. So, and then over time, you find out, like in the next 6 to 9 months, the parents, the grandmother, the uncle, whomever, have learned to understand when their child or cousin, whomever, is going through something, and how to connect with them and, level with them, instead of just telling them that, they're acting like that, or they're being this stereotype. So a lot of it, and it does come with, and a lot of times I see it come with the religious families too. So it was like going hand in hand. Right. So my fingers were happy typing.
That is huge. Manage versus fixing. The first thing I tell all of my clients when they walk into my office, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to help you manage who you are, with hopes that you can become a better version of you. Because if this was diabetes, sure, there are things that you could potentially do to reverse it. And there are things that you could do to reverse your severity of depression, right? But really a healthy approach is, how can I educate you? How can I provide you the tools to manage this? Because when you go to the gym, when you want to be a healthier version of you, you don't go for 2 weeks and stop. Now, of course, I'm sure all of us have been there before, but we all know the outcome to that. It's typically when we go over a long period of time and we manage that goal that we see our best results. So before we continue, a couple of great things really quickly in the chat. Ezra, she stated that media and social media representing mental illness in a false manner. There is a very clear evidence that people's perceptions of mental illness come from what they see in the media, and in particular, when they have not experienced someone with mental illness in person themselves. And so therefore, they have a false sense or perception of symptoms that are often portrayed or catastrophizes the condition. That's big. I see that a lot. In my minority families within my practice, they go by what they see on television. And so when their child does come to them, like Shinomso had stated earlier, they think of the worst case scenario and they shut down the whole idea. Chinoso also mentioned, hence why Talk Niger, his organization, has t-shirts that say prayer plus therapy. So we're gonna, plug that in there. And let's see. Yep. So let's keep it moving because of time. I'm going to show a few seconds of this clip here. So if we can make sure that we are listening attentively. 340.
This perception that everybody else has around us, we've taken it in and we've kind of lived it out.
I feel like it's something wrong to admit that you have some form of mental challenge.
Taboo in the African American community it can be hard. Both my mother and father have that they're carrying that weight of our ancestors, of their parents and what they went through. So much mental damage was done to the African American community through slavery.
They'd much rather tell you that they got AIDS before they tell you that they have some form of mental illness. And it's just that much stigma.
When you're seeking help, when you're trying to become well, if you get a deep cut and you go to the doctor, you don't say, oh, that's a white thing, I'm not gonna go to the doctor. My leg is bleeding and I'm losing feeling, but I'm not gonna go to the doctor.
first thing you have to do is remove the so-called stigma from it.
Because African American people need to really comprehend what mental health illness is before we can proceed with any other, area of achievement in America.
Today I'm challenged because I suffer from major depression. And I'm fortunate to find a man that treated the depression and not just zonked me out so I wouldn't be a problem.
Everybody needs support. Everybody has that one person or that friend or whoever, relative, whoever, that they call on when they just need to talk to somebody. And that's really what therapy is.
So I stopped it at that's really what therapy is, because I'm hoping in the future we can have a conversation in this lens to what Zoe had stated earlier. Therapy doesn't have to look the same for everyone. That's a whole nother conversation, so we're not going to get into that. But on this next slide, I would like to ask you all, for the audience as well as our panel members, are you inclined or open to seeking therapy and or medication? Let's start with Dr. Shelley. Share with us if you are inclined.
100%. I have a therapist.
Awesome.
So I'm sorry.
No, you were going in and out.
That I go to. Oh, okay. I think it's my network. I apologize.
That's okay. That's all right.
Yeah. So I do go to therapy every other weekend.
Awesome.
So every other Saturdays I see my therapist. I mean, obviously, as some of you know, I lost my dad last year. So just and then overall just trying to be a better human being, making good decisions, especially as an educator and as a counselor, making sure that I'm right to help somebody else. So absolutely.
Thank you. Dr. Walton.
Thank you, Dr. Shelley. It's a good segue for me because in my previous marriage, from that divorce, I knew I needed to see someone. And my friends, thankfully, I have an African-American female friend in New York, and she also knew, as I spoke to her, and it's good then to speak to people. And I'm also just going to segue to your clip and quickly just stop, because I like to be brief. But men, African-American men, are going to be even less likely, not just mental health, physical health. And so again, it was episodic, as Dr. Shelley talked about. It was going through that divorce and separation, and it was, I'm already really, really small, but imagine I was losing weight and I did see someone, and super, super helpful. So
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Walton. We're going to go to Agatha, and then we'll go to Chinomso before we move on.
Short answer, absolutely yes. And the part of me that's battling in my mind on this question is the fact of, yes, I can acknowledge that I would seek therapy and pursue it. But I want to say it was Dr. Walton who made a comment earlier that we don't prioritize our own mental wellness. So that's the part of me that keeps me from doing that, because I'm not putting that first, if that makes sense. So I find myself going both ways, like, yeah, I can go with it, but will I make the time for it for my own?
That's huge. Prioritizing. In today's time when we're all juggling a million and one things, it is tough to prioritize. And I think it was someone mentioned earlier that, if your leg hurts, or maybe it was the video, if your leg hurts, we're more than likely at some point going to see a doctor. We at some point will choose to prioritize that. And we need to do the same for the parts of us that the outside world cannot see, and that's your mental wellness. I just want to throw out there, Ezra Hassan, thank you so much for your transparency in the chat. She shared a little bit about her own mental health history and diagnosis, so thank you for that. Chinomso Choi, and then we're going to move on because of time.
Yeah, so I'll try to make it quick. So yes, I do. I am on medication, antidepressants, for the last 3 years. And it's one of the best decisions I made for myself. And I also do see a therapist bi-weekly. And I always tell my friends just because you're seeing a therapist doesn't mean that something is necessarily wrong. I'm more of in the mindset to be proactive with your mental health as opposed to reactive. So like me, for example, when I lost my dad, it was a shock, but I was able to recover because I already had the tools in my mental health toolbox. And Dr. Walton, just to kind of plug this, because you are right, men, we don't seek help as much, but there's been a trend with that changing. So I just want to plug an event we have coming up on the 29th. It's, Minding Our Minds, African American men talking about mental health. Is going to be on Zoom. So I think that'll be something great for you guys to check out as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Troy, how about you?
Yes, I think some valid points were made. The doctor's absolutely right. Went through the same thing. And, you never want to go seek counseling and speak to anybody about it, I think for me, I had someone, close friend of mine who convinced me that I should go and talk. But also, after 21 years of military service, you would imagine that I've seen a lot, I've been through a lot, been in a lot of places that isn't, as pleasant, done some unpleasant stuff. So, it's one of those things where going to see a therapist and psychiatrist, everything is one of the best things that I've done to help me, So yes, it's something that I encourage. It's something that I welcome, and I think the gentleman made a great point. It's something that we should continue to talk about within the community. And there's another point I wanted to make. Ooh, it was in my head, it went out.
I'm sure it will return.
Yeah, anyway.
Since the thought went out, as we wait for it to return, I'm just going to read something that Grace dropped in the chat before we go on to the next slide. And she stated that her perspective on therapy, and I completely agree with this, is that it is needs-based. So you have routine checkups without needing to be sick, right? We typically should all be going for our annual screenings or annual checkups, even if you're not feeling unwell. Therapy is the same. In her opinion, it is one of the most important. When your brain and mental wellness isn't functioning at its optimal level, everything else will suffer. All right, and Chinosa sent me the link to me directly in WhatsApp, so I'll be sure to share it with everyone as well after this, if you're unable to grab it from the chat here. All right, this next quote, stemming from the country of Senegal: 2 important factors must be considered in understanding the community's attitude about psychiatric treatment for mental illness. 1 is the feeling among many people that the discipline of psychiatry was forced upon Africa. And I'm actually going to insert was forced upon pretty much any culture outside of the Western world, because it's not just Africa that feels this way, but was forced upon Africa by Europeans, and that many people want to reaffirm their cultural roots. And I wrote this down earlier. Choi, when you had stated that moving to the US is where I learned about mental illness, it brought me to this quote, because part of what perpetuates negative stereotypes is the feeling that it was forced upon us and that we don't experience these things because we have religion, right? Or because we have other things. It is not normal within our society to experience depression. One of the things I heard growing up is, what do you have to be depressed about? Right? Your family worked really hard to get you to where you are. You've got the things that you need. There's nothing to be depressed about. Or your white friend, that's what they do in their house, right? Because they're spoiled, but you don't have anything to be depressed about. So can I have an audience member share their thoughts on this, on the fact that many of our people within the diaspora and on the continent and within other minority cultures truly believe that this was forced upon us by Europeans. Or a panel member, that's okay too. Zoe, okay, one of our board members.
I think one of the reasons, aside from the fact that plenty of things have been forced on minority cultures from people of European descent or other more Western cultures, so that certainly is true across many aspects. But I think psychology or psychiatric treatment has evolved quite a bit from the traditional, more traditional sense of it, where it was framed from a very Western lens. As we know, if you're not from the Western world, if you reside on the continent of Africa or in another country that has pretty significant cultural differences, psychiatric treatment, mental health treatment was based in a sense of what is normal is what European or Western culture consists of. So I think part of it is the lack of diversity, which I believe is cultural diversity is a big thing now across the board in all disciplines, but in psychology and mental health treatment, that has changed a lot to where I believe in my studies, in my education, in my professional experiences, you now do training to make sure that you have respect for an individual's cultural differences, for their backgrounds, for their traditions. And I don't believe initially that was the approach that was taken when psychiatric studies were brought to minorities. And so when someone is coming with something that's unfamiliar and doesn't value or respect your traditions and your culture, I believe that's a large reason of why this perception came about and why it still exists today.
I just want to say, I don't think you could have said that any better. I mean, that's huge. Language, culture, it's so huge. And that's what pushed me into the world of psychiatry and mental health as well. I remember when I was still in Rhode Island, one of the very first families that I worked with, they were from Liberia and they had experienced the Civil War. And what really clicked for me is this family, this mom, she had seen so much devastation. And my Caucasian American counterparts, immediately I know that they had misdiagnosed her. They had minimized her experience simply because they didn't understand the culture that she came from. One of the examples, if you go to many minority countries, when someone dies, sometimes you might see someone rolling around on the floor. That doesn't mean that does not equate to a psychotic break within that culture's context because of the way that emotions are expressed. However, if that is to be assessed within a Western context, that could come off as someone having a psychotic break versus maybe struggling with depression or situational depression because of the event in which they experienced. But I think, like you said, Zoe, a lot has to do with it because the history shows that so much was forced upon us. It is truly believed that this also just happens to be one of them. Ezra shared in a chat that her grandfather is Kenyan, and he absolutely had this same view about psychiatry. And then Catherine McCaffrey, she shared that she has two different roles within the mental health field. First, she is an LICSW who is in private practice, but she's also an attorney who petitions the court to certify individuals with serious mental illness to make sure that they get treatment if they present as a danger to themselves or others. And she is curious to know, what do we think about forced treatment? So just because of time, I'm going to pick one person from the panel to share their thoughts on forced treatment. Let's go with Grace. What are your thoughts on this? So it's petitioned by the courts. It is court-appointed treatment. It must happen.
So I guess I'm thinking about this in from a lot of different lenses. And I have a lot of questions. So clearly we don't have enough time for me to ask you all of the questions. But when you say forced treatment, I'm thinking, is this, because I know I've had to mandate people to go to the emergency room because they're a danger to themselves. I think in the terms of the court, because it's a process, if there is a space where family members, community members of this person, the forced treatment is in concert with loved ones, people that know this person, because we know mental illness is not an issue of choice, right? Sometimes your mind is severely impacted, that your executive function is offline, and it's challenging to make decisions that you would normally make if you're in a different condition. So I think sometimes there is a need for support system. That's why part of my work is to ensure that people have support system that they trust. And similar to people having will of a power of attorney to make decisions for them in a medical sense, we should have that for mental health, right? Because there is a time that you can go offline and you can't make decisions that will be beneficial to you in the moment. So I think if it's in concert with loved ones, people that the person trusts, people that the person know, then I feel like that's something that can be feasible. If the person is online and their executive functioning is capable of making decisions that is in their interest, and they don't want treatment, then they shouldn't be forced into treatment. So I think there's so many factors that adds to this. So I'm reading Catherine comment.
6-month court orders in reference to Rhode Island courts.
Okay. So I can imagine there is a lot of pieces that go into the enforcement of this. And again, if there are loved ones and people that this person trusts at the table while decisions are being made, I think it's appropriate, because we have a power of attorney for reasons. And I think it should be similar in mental health.
So I'm just going to add to that, and then we're going to continue. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There are a couple of nuances to forced treatment, and I think it was Sobi who asked, how can it even be enforced? So one example is anger management. Let's say there's domestic abuse happening, the court might mandate anger management for 8 weeks. There's also someone who might be suicidal, who has either attempted or threatened to harm themselves in the past, and their maybe they're picked up by the police, they're court ordered to make sure that they're inpatient or an acute inpatient for 2 to 6 weeks. Something like inpatient, it's really hard to leave, because when you're inpatient, you really can't leave. But something like anger management, the person still has to get up, get in their car, and go to treatment willingly. Typically, the way that it would be enforced, depending on the state, is if you don't go, maybe you violate probation, or you get picked up by the police and then they mandate something else. But then the other part of forced treatment is, depending on the person's cognitive state, and they have the ability to make informed decisions to a certain capacity, you can't make someone do something they don't want to do. That goes for someone who may not have a mental illness, and that also goes for someone who has a mental illness. Just like a doctor cannot make you have surgery. They cannot legally, they cannot strap you to a table and cut you open. It's the same way that I cannot force someone to take medication. I cannot force someone to come to their sessions. So there has to be a degree of willingness there. And that's just to answer your question, Sobi. Let's see. And thank you for that question, Catherine. That was actually, and statement, that was a good one. So we've already talked about this a little bit, so we're not going to spend much time, but the statement, mental health, oh, that's a white man's thing. As we know, it's absolutely not. What I do think is something to keep into consideration is maybe the language that comes with psychiatry could be considered a white man's thing, because early on, and even still till today, it did not, and in many ways still does not lend to various cultures. All right, how about this one? Kids today are just spoiled. We went through the same things they did in our day, and we're fine. Let me get an audience member. Who has thoughts about this one? Dr. Walton, let's hear it.
Well, I'm an educator. I'm a principal, elementary school principal. And so certainly we hear this a lot, and especially from older parents, parents or grandparents. And so just the second part of the statement, we're fine. We are not fine. And we need to know that. I think it's been spoken about here today. Just as we tend to our physical health by doing the routine, we have to also do that with our mental health and do the routine so that we maintain mental health stability.
Thank you for saying that, because many are not fine. But the first step is acceptance, and one of the barriers to acceptance is lack of education, right? But also, there are many of those who have what we might describe as the old way of thinking. It really is still stigma. I don't want to be seen by my counterparts, my peers, my family members as being weak, right? As being the family member who can't handle their emotions, as being the family member who's hearing voices. So therefore, that equates to externally, I'm fine, even though they are not. All right, quick check-in. I really should have done this earlier, but can I get a thumbs up? Are we all feeling okay? All right, excellent. I see a couple of thumbs. Okay, there we go. We're almost done. We've got a couple of minutes. I don't want us to go over too long, but I'm going to pull out 2 volunteers to finish this statement. And it starts as, I wanted my mother and or father to know I felt blank, but blank. And you will fill that in with as much transparency with which you are comfortable. So I will have Zoe Walton be one person to complete this. And Ezra Hassan, if you're open to completing this for us as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm fine with doing this because I actually texted my mother, and both of my parents are actually on, so that's always great. But I texted my mom during this after she had shared, but I wanted my mother and father to know that I felt, and I'm going to give the disorder, but PMDD when I was 15, when I had first started my period. For those of you that don't know, it's premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and that thing was kicking my butt. But I didn't tell them because I felt that word crazy, because I had never seen my mom go through anything like that, as a female or anything, that was still having her periods at the time. So I felt that word, and I felt ashamed because I couldn't control the thoughts that I was having in my head that were probably along the lines of BPD.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate your transparency. Ezra, how about you, if you're comfortable with sharing?
Yeah, so I wanted my mother and father to know I felt actually, I was suicidal when I was 15 at the time, and turned to self-harm. And I wanted to not tell them actually. Mm-hmm. So in terms of what I wanted to know, what I wanted them to know I felt, I didn't want them to know I felt anything. I don't. Even when I did tell them eventually, it was exactly how I expected them to react. So I didn't. So,
thank you for that. And that is also what perpetuates the stigma. It's the responses that many will still give till today. And I do want to throw out there that it's important to keep in our minds that human beings only do as much as they know. And if someone doesn't have the education, if they don't have the background, if they haven't had the conversations, they won't know to respond otherwise. If religion is all you know, your response will have a religious undertone. If psychiatry is all you know, your response will have a psychiatric undertone. And so we also want to meet people where they are and bring them into the conversation without shaming them either, because that doesn't help. That doesn't help the process. So thank you to Zoe and Ezra for that. We don't have time for this last question, which is fine because I actually elaborate on it on the next slide. This last question just says, how would you suggest mental health services to your parent if you know that they will receive culturally competent care? Let me go back a couple really quickly. I will go over some of the changes that are being made within the diaspora. So in Jamaica, recently, they implemented what is known as Caribbean Wellness Day. It's an annual event that is geared towards increasing awareness and promoting activities to address non-communicable diseases, such as mental health illnesses. Within the African American Church, and Zoe, you had mentioned this earlier, but I do want to commend, there are a lot of churches that are involving mental health specialists. I'm finding that a lot of pastors are deciding to either go and get some education, or they are being intentional about bringing in trained mental health professionals to help them deal with the mental illnesses that they are seeing within the church versus ignoring them. In South Africa, we're finding that they are increasing public education. They're putting money into awareness campaigns. And then, in Cape Verde, they're implementing epidemiology studies. And I think this is very important. And I'm so glad that they're doing this, the studies on depression, specifically in the aging communities. And why this is important is because a lot of people don't know this, but it is those who are in the later stages of life. And so I'm talking about ages 65 and older, are actually suffering from clinical depression at alarming rates because they are ending the narrative life. And a lot of people don't talk to them about that, right? So when we think about things such as death and passing on, we kind of leave that for a certain age group, but we're not talking to them about it because we see it as, well, they're getting ready to transition anyway. But those are the individuals that are at a time in their life where they can reflect on all of these years and say, this is everything I did not do. I'm 65 years old, I'm 72 years old, and I didn't do A, B, C, and D, but they're at home. They are, they're either widowed or they're widowed and they're retired and they're by themselves. Their children are grown out in the world doing their own thing. And we don't realize that they are left alone to reflect on a life that they might be regretting. And so clinical depression happens at alarming rates for those who are in later stages of life. So it is great that they are doing these studies in Cape Verde or Cabo Verde. Next question, we're not going to go over because of time. Closing, the only thing that I was going to have each of you do, but we don't have time for, is just naming one thing that you are taking away from today's chat. So what I'm going to do is call on one person to share what they are taking away from today's chat, and then we are going to wrap up. And that person is going to be, let's go with Lisette Rice. Can you share with us one thing that you've taken away from today?
I think I've taken away more than one, but definitely the focus on self-care as well. I'm an educator, a behavior therapist, mother of child with autism and a child with depression. So I think it is very important that I also look at my responses to them, because I did, with some of the discussion, I do realize that even some of my responses may have perpetuated some of the stigma. Even though I'm educated, I just need to be mindful as well of my words and maybe seek further help in how I approach them and how I care for myself.
Thank you so much, Lisette. We're all human. We all make mistakes. No one is perfect. There's not a medical doctor that's perfect, and there's not a mental health professional that's perfect. We all get it wrong sometimes. Key is to be mindful. So thank you for that. If you are open, please feel free to drop in the chat what your one takeaway was. And if you are not following us on social media, I don't know what you're doing, but you should do that now. So please get out your phones and make sure that you are following us on Facebook and you are following us on Instagram. As Rita had mentioned when we first started, this is an annual conversation. But it's a conversation that could happen, much more frequently. But so that you are aware of what Taka is doing in the near future, make sure that you're following us. If you have any questions, for those of you who do have my contact, please feel free to reach out. And if you want to drop it in a chat, that's great as well. It is 4:07. Thank you all for your time today.
Before you leave, everyone, I would like to thank, obviously, Natasha for taking this on once again and being such a phenomenal facilitator, really organizing this from beginning to end. And Zoe, for your help. Let's see, Agada, Chinomso, Choi, Grace, Shelley, and Zoe, thank you so much for being panelists. Everybody, thank you for joining us. And yes, please continue to follow us. Of course, this is an annual thing, and hopefully maybe we'll add another one semi-annually, but it's obviously a huge subject that we can only peel one layer at a time, as much as we'd love to spend a lot of time doing it. And I also want to say that we will be rolling something that Natasha will be spearheading. Natasha, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but it's called Dear Taka Tuesday. And if you want to talk a little bit about that, then we'll let everybody go.
Yes, absolutely. Really quickly. So Dear Taka Tuesdays is going to be an anonymous, let's see, kind of an anonymous, I don't know what word I would use. Advice column. And it's going to be on Tuesdays where I will be responding to individuals who will ask questions anonymously related to mental health, related to a couple of other things, and we'll share those details on the Taka platform. And I will be responding again to those individuals. So it's going to be like a column of sorts. It's going to be hopefully give people the opportunity to ask a question and get feedback that maybe they're not ready to ask outwardly, and get, connected to resources and support.
Yes.
Teresa, I'm sorry, I apologize, Rita. Teresa stated that talking to a therapist does not mean you're crazy, but that you're willing to get help that you need to make you a better person. Absolutely.
Wonderful.
And I like that. I like that everyone is dropping their information in here. Great, yes. Please do that. Zoe Walton, dearyou.me.com. She has written a journal. She's an author of a journal. Chinomso has @talknaija.org, and on Instagram, it is also talknaija.org. If you are interested in checking out my website, it is ittandwellness.com. Yeah, happy Saturday, everyone. Go on to be great, stay safe, don't talk to strangers, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yes. Thank you all very much. Stay well and healthy.
Go on, take care.
In mind and body and soul.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Hey, good weekend.
You too, Shelley.